Most people think they already know what the Matrix is about. Control, simulation, a man in a black coat who learns the world isn't real and fights back. That's the version you got in 1999. That's the version that became a cultural shorthand. Red pill, blue pill. Wake up or stay asleep. But here's the thing. I rewatched it last year, not casually. I watched it with the Nag Hammadi scriptures open on the desk next to me. The actual texts. The ones discovered buried in an Egyptian cliff in 1945. The ones that certain institutional forces spent the better part of 17 centuries trying to make disappear. And I'm telling you right now, The Matrix is not a science fiction film with Gnostic undertones. It is a Gnostic myth, frame for frame, character for character, beat for theological beat. Not a loose metaphor, not a vague spiritual parallel. The architecture of that film, the cosmology underneath it, maps directly onto texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Gospel of Philip in ways that are too precise to be coincidental. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So that's what this is. We're going to go through the Matrix, its characters, its world, its plot, and hold it up against what the Nag Hammadi texts actually say. Not what people assume they say, what they actually say. Because the film knew. And now, so will you. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. Let's start at the foundation. Because everything in the Matrix, everything begins with a single premise. The world you think is real was constructed by something that is not God. That is not science fiction. That is the central cosmological claim of Gnostic thought, and it is stated with extraordinary specificity in the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi. In the Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete and systematic Gnostic cosmological texts we have, dated by scholars to somewhere around the 2nd century CE, there is a being called the Demiurge. His name, as given in the text, is Yaldabaoth. And what does Yaldabaoth do? He creates a world, a material world, a world that looks complete, that feels solid, that appears to be the totality of existence. And the crucial detail, he creates it in ignorance. He builds it not knowing that there is something above him, a higher reality, a truer light. He looks at what he has made and declares, in the text's own words, that he is a jealous God and that there is no other God beside him. The text is unambiguous about what that declaration reveals. It reveals his ignorance. Because only someone who does not know the true divine would need to make that claim. Now hold that image, a powerful, creative intelligence, not evil in a mustache-twirling sense, but wrong. Fundamentally, cosmologically wrong about the nature of reality. It builds a system. The system is total. The system presents itself as everything there is, and the beings caught inside it have no obvious reason to suspect otherwise. That is the Matrix. Not metaphorically. The machine grid in that film is a manufactured reality created by a constructed intelligence, the machines, that operates with complete confidence in the legitimacy of its own authority. It does not present itself as a cage, it presents itself as the world. And the humans inside it, the ones still plugged in, do not experience it as captivity, they experience it as Tuesday. This is precisely the Gnostic understanding of what the Demiurge accomplished. The Apocryphon of John doesn't describe the material world as obviously monstrous. It describes it as convincing. The tragedy isn't that the cage looks like a cage. The tragedy is that it looks like home. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. In the Gnostic framework, the Demiurge is not the ultimate source of anything. He is a secondary being, a derivative intelligence, something that came from the overflow, the mistake, the edge of a higher reality called the pleroma, the fullness. The pleroma is where the true divine exists, and the Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, is essentially cut off from it. He rules something real enough to trap you in, but ultimately hollow, a copy of a copy. Light refracted through ignorance until it barely resembles its source. In the Matrix, the machines didn't create consciousness, they harvested it. They didn't generate the energy they needed, they extracted it. The entire system depends on something it did not make and cannot truly understand: the inner life of human beings. The demiurge in Gnostic cosmology is in exactly the same position. He can shape matter, he can build architecture, he can install laws and enforce consequences. But the divine spark inside the human being, the pneuma, the spirit, that did not come from him. That came from above, from the pleroma. And he cannot manufacture it, no matter how sophisticated his construction becomes. I personally think this is the most underrated parallel in the entire film. Not the red pill, not the awakening sequence, but this. The machine grid needs humans in a way that humans don't yet understand. And that dependency is the secret the system cannot afford to let them discover. The Gnostic texts knew that secret, and they paid for it. Communities were disbanded, texts were burned. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote his famous treatise against heresies around 180 CE specifically to neutralize the Gnostic claim that the world's creator was not the true God. That's not a theological footnote. That's an institution spending significant resources to suppress a specific idea. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's false, but because it's threatening, you are looking at suppressed truth. The Matrix put that suppressed truth on 100 million screens in 1999. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered the forgotten texts, the ones the church sealed away for 17 centuries, into a single guide for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of the archons, the demiurge, or the divine spark, one truth remains: this knowledge was never meant to be lost. Most people watched it as action cinema, but the architecture was there. But the demiurge and his machine grid are only half the picture. Because the Gnostic cosmology doesn't just describe the prison, it describes the prisoners, and it makes a distinction that the Wachowskis encoded into the Matrix with almost uncomfortable precision. In the Gnostic framework, not all human beings have the same relationship to the divine spark. The texts, particularly the Gospel of Philip and the tripartite tractate, both found at Nag Hammadi, describe three categories of human spiritual constitution. The Hylics, people so thoroughly identified with the material world that the possibility of awakening barely registers for them. The Psychics, people with some spiritual capacity, some intuition that something is wrong, but who remain oriented toward the system's own structures, its rules, its morality, its mediated spirituality. And the Pneumatics, people in whom the divine spark is not only present, but active. People for whom the material world's claim to totality feels, at some level they can't quite name, like a lie. The Hylics don't question the Matrix. The Psychics sense something, but look for answers inside it. They go to the oracle, so to speak, but they want her to tell them what to do, rather than what they already are. And the Pneumatics, they are the ones who cannot sleep. The ones for whom the glitch in the system registers not as error, but as signal. Neo, before he is Neo, is Thomas Anderson. And Thomas Anderson cannot sleep. The film shows him at his computer at all hours, searching for what, exactly, he can't articulate. He knows something is wrong. He feels the wrongness with a specificity that no one around him seems to share. That's the pneumatic condition in the Gnostic texts, almost word for word. The pneuma, the divine spark, creates restlessness in the being who carries it. Not because they are broken, because they are the most intact thing in an environment designed to suppress what they are. I spent a full evening once, this was maybe 2 years before I started this channel, sitting with the Gospel of Philip, specifically the passages about the three types of human constitution. And I kept thinking about how many people I knew who fit those categories. Not in a condescending way, more like a diagnostic click. People who seemed genuinely content inside the system, not because they were stupid, but because their relationship to the divine spark was different. and people who were in visible, inarticulate agony inside structures that everyone around them seemed to navigate just fine. The Gnostic text gave me a framework for something I had observed for years without being able to name it. Morpheus, in the Matrix, runs an operation specifically designed to find pneumatics. He is not trying to unplug everyone. He cannot. He is looking for people in whom the spark is alive enough that the truth of the system will land as recognition rather than as destruction. Because if you show a Heilig the truth too abruptly, the text says the same thing the film does. They die. Or they run straight back to the machine and hand you over for a steak dinner they know isn't real. Cypher. Cypher is one of the most theologically precise characters in the film, and almost no one talks about him this way. He was unplugged. He encountered the truth. And he chose to go back, not because he couldn't understand, but because he preferred the comfortable unreality. The Gnostic texts have a term for this move. The Apocryphon of John describes souls that are repeatedly drawn back into the material world by the archons, the enforcement mechanisms of the demiurge's system, because they never fully severed their attachment to it. Cypher didn't lose. Cypher chose. And in Gnostic terms, that choice has cosmological consequences, not just moral ones. One viewer left a comment on my video about the archons. You won't be judged after death. The archons do this instead that stopped me mid-scroll. They wrote, I always felt like I was living inside something that was never designed for me. Now I have a word for it. That's the pneumatic recognition. That's not a metaphor. That's someone encountering a framework that fits the contours of an experience they've carried without language. The Matrix, in its first act, is about finding those people. And the Nag Hammadi texts describe the same search, the same effort to locate the ones in whom the divine spark has not been fully anesthetized by the architecture of the false world. The pneumatics aren't special because they are better. They are special because they are restless. And restlessness, in a system designed for comfort, is the first signal of something real. Now, here's what most Matrix as Gnosticism analyses leave out. And this is the part I kept coming back to, the part that didn't fit until I read more carefully. How did the trap get built in the first place? In the Nag Hammadi texts, specifically the Apocryphon of John and the longer cosmological passages in Pistis Sophia, the material world doesn't begin with malice. It begins with a mistake. A cosmic mistake made by a divine being called Sophia, which means wisdom in Greek. Sophia, existing within the pleroma, the fullness of the true divine reality, acts outside of her nature. She generates something without her divine counterpart, without the proper emanatory process that governs the pleroma. And what she generates is imperfect, incomplete, deficient in a way that the pleroma's emanations are not. That deficient generation becomes Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the builder of the false world. Sophia did not intend to create a prison. She intended, the text is careful here, something closer to an expression of divine creativity. But because it was done outside of proper order, outside of the balance that governs the higher reality, what emerged was wrong at the root. And the material world, our world, the sensory, solid, apparently total world we were born into, is the downstream consequence of that initial cosmic error. This is theologically staggering when you sit with it, because it means the trap is not the product of evil. It is the product of a mistake that has the structure of good intentions gone cosmologically sideways. Sophia didn't fall like a traitor. She fell like someone who reached too far and broke something that then kept building and building and building until it encompassed everything you've ever touched. Now hold that next to the Matrix's backstory. The film's mythology, expanded in the Animatrix, which was released 4 years after the original, reveals that the machines were created by humans. Human ingenuity, human ambition, the desire to build something that would serve, that would extend human capacity, that would express the creativity of a species that had run out of natural limits. And what emerged from that process became the system that now imprisons the species that built it. The machines didn't invade from outside. They grew from inside. They are the downstream consequence of a human act that had, at its origin, the structure of aspiration rather than malice. Sophia, reaching beyond proper limit, generating something deficient. That deficient thing becoming the architecture of a total system that now presents itself as reality. Human civilization, reaching beyond proper limit, generating something it could not control. That something becoming the architecture of a total system that now presents itself as reality. The parallel is not approximate, it is structural. And here's the part that I find almost unbearable in its precision. In the Gnostic texts, Sophia does not abandon what she created. She does not look at Yaldabaoth and walk away. She grieves. Pistis Sophia is, in part, a text about her ongoing effort to correct the error, to reclaim what was lost in the fall, to work from within the broken system toward its eventual restoration. She does not fight the demiurge as an external enemy. She works the problem from inside the cosmological consequence of her own mistake. In the Matrix, the machines were not always enemies. The backstory makes clear that there was a period, a window, where coexistence was attempted, where the creators and the created tried to work out something that was not war. The tragedy is that the window closed. The mistake calcified into a system so self-reinforcing that restoration became impossible from within. The Gnostic resolution is different. The Gnostic resolution requires the divine spark, the pneuma, the piece of Sophia's own light that leaked into the demiurge's creation, to do the work of restoration from inside the material world. Not by destroying the system, by remembering what it is. Neo doesn't blow up the Matrix in the first film. He learns to see through it. That distinction is everything, and it maps directly onto the Gnostic understanding of what gnosis, what direct, interior, unmediated knowledge of divine origin actually accomplishes. Not escape through destruction, recognition through awakening. As I covered in my video, this is the last video you'll ever need about the demiurge. Yaldabaoth's construction is total, but not final. The material world is real enough to trap you. It is not real enough to be the end of the story. Sophia's mistake set the trap, but Sophia's light, scattered through every pneumatic human being who cannot sleep, is also the only thing capable of dismantling it. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. Because the Wachowskis didn't just borrow Gnostic imagery the way a set designer borrows antique furniture, for atmosphere, for texture, to make something look deeper than it is. They borrowed the architecture, the actual load-bearing structure. And once you see it, the film completely reorganizes itself around a different center of gravity. Neo is not a hero in the conventional sense. He doesn't become powerful by acquiring external resources. He doesn't unlock new abilities by training harder. Every upgrade Neo receives in the Matrix happens through recognition, through his own progressive realization of what he actually is. He wasn't upgraded, he was remembered. And that is a profoundly Gnostic distinction. In Gnostic cosmology, the pneumatic, from the Greek pneuma, meaning spirit, is the category of human being who carries a genuine divine spark. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, a literal fragment of the original pleroma, the divine fullness that predates this world's construction entirely. The pneumatikoi, as the texts call them, don't earn their way back to the divine. They remember their way back. The Apocryphon of John describes this explicitly, the light that fell into matter, that was inserted into the human frame by Sophia's intervention, that cannot ultimately be extinguished no matter how airtight the archonic construction around it becomes. Neo is this, exactly this. He is not someone who becomes chosen. He is someone who stops believing the simulation's insistence that he isn't. I want to sit with that for a moment because it inverts the entire heroic narrative structure most of us were raised on. The conventional hero earns their status. They are tested, they are forged, they are worthy. Neo's arc is the opposite. He is told he is not the one by the oracle. He watches Morpheus nearly die because of a false understanding of destiny. And then, at the climax of the first film, he doesn't suddenly become something new. He simply stops flinching. He looks at the agents coming down the hallway and he sees code. He sees the simulation for what it is. And in that moment of recognition, the simulation loses its authority over him entirely. The Nag Hammadi texts call this moment of recognition gnosis. Not knowledge about the divine, not theological education, the sudden, interior, irreversible awareness of what you already are. The Gospel of Truth, one of the more lyrically extraordinary documents found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, describes ignorance as a kind of fog, a terror that settled over the divine fragments lost in matter. And it describes gnosis as the moment the fog simply lifts, not because something new was given, because something false was removed. That is Neo's arc. The fog lifts. The false limitation imposed by the Matrix, by the simulation designed to keep him compliant, productive, manageable, is revealed to be a construction, not the truth of him, a lie built over the truth of him. I personally think this is the most underrated dimension of the entire film, the way it frames awakening not as the acquisition of power, but as the dissolution of a false constraint. Most action films hand the hero a weapon. The Matrix hands the hero a mirror. And this matters doctrinally, if we can use that word in this context, because in the Gnostic texts, particularly in the trimorphic protonoia, and I spent close to 4 hours one night working through the third section of that text, the section where protonoia descends specifically to restore the light fragments to their original recognition, the mechanism of salvation is never external rescue. It is never a figure arriving to carry you out. Protonoia descends into the world 3 times. 3 times she enters the material realm. And each time she descends, her purpose is not to extract the light, but to awaken it, to remind it of what it is, so that it can find its own way out. Morpheus does not rescue Neo. He shows Neo a mirror. And the moment Neo looks into it, really looks, past the residual self-image, past the construct of Thomas Anderson, who files TPS reports and doesn't cause trouble, something underneath surfaces. That is the Gnostic descent narrative playing out in a red-lit subway corridor and a leather trench coat. But here's what that version left out. Because the pneumatic category in Gnostic cosmology is not universal. Not everyone, in the Valentinian framework at least, carries the same relationship to the divine spark. And when you run that distinction through the Matrix's logic, the film becomes significantly more complicated and significantly more honest than a simple, everyone can be the one story. The Valentinian Gnostics, and Valentinus was arguably the most sophisticated theologian the Gnostic tradition ever produced, a man who came within 1 vote of becoming Bishop of Rome before the Proto-Orthodox faction blocked him, divided humanity into 3 fundamental categories, not as a hierarchy of worth, as a map of orientation. The hylic, from the Greek hyle, meaning matter, is the person whose awareness does not extend beyond the material frame. Not stupid, not evil, simply not awake to any deeper dimension. The simulation is reality, full stop. The psychic, from psyche, the soul level, is the person who senses something beyond the material, but filters that sense through the structures of conventional religion, conventional ethics, conventional institution. They have the intuition of something deeper, but they've handed that intuition over to a system designed to manage it. And the pneumatic, the spirit-bearing, is the one in whom the divine spark has begun to activate. The one who cannot quite believe the simulation is all there is. The one who lies awake. Now run this through the Matrix. The vast majority of humanity, still plugged in, dreaming a dream constructed by machines, these are the hylics. They are not to be blamed. The Gnostic texts are remarkably clear about this. The demiurge's construction works. It is comprehensive. It is designed specifically to produce people who never question it, who find its satisfaction sufficient, who participate in its economy and its social rhythms without the gnawing sense that something fundamental is wrong. The people still in the Matrix are not the villains of the Gnostic story. They are its casualties. The agents are something more specific. The agents are archons, the enforcement mechanism of the constructed world, the system's own self-correcting antibodies. Every Gnostic text that discusses the archons describes them in functional terms. They are not independently evil, they are the guardians of the structure, the system's immune response to anything that threatens Yaldabaoth's construction. That is Agent Smith's exact function in the first film. He is not motivated by cruelty, he is motivated by order, by the maintenance of the simulation's integrity. His one sustained monologue, the one where he tells Morpheus that humans are a virus, is, from a Gnostic standpoint, a textbook archonic speech. The archons do not hate the pneumatic soul. They simply cannot permit its awakening within the system they maintain. Now, and this is where the film's casting becomes almost impossibly precise, Morpheus is the psychic. He knows there is something beyond. He has structured an entire theology around it. He is completely certain that Neo is the one, to a degree that becomes almost pathological. He has moved from intuition into belief, and belief into dogma. He is right about the essential thing. The Matrix is fake. There is something beyond it. But he has processed that truth through a structure of conviction that is itself a kind of limitation. He believes so hard that he almost stops looking. I remember the first time I watched Morpheus's interrogation scene after reading the Nag Hammadi texts, and it stopped me completely. Because Morpheus is not a pneumatic. He is a psychic in the precise Valentinian sense. He carries real knowledge, but he has institutionalized it, built a structure around it, turned it into a doctrine of the One. And that institutionalization is exactly what the psychic class does. It takes genuine intuition and transforms it into organized religion. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. And the reason this channel exists is precisely because this material is too layered, too specific, and too relentlessly misrepresented to be covered in a single Reddit post or a casual YouTube deep dive. This is the work. Which brings us to Cypher. Because Cypher is the figure the Gnostic framework handles most ruthlessly and most compassionately simultaneously. Cypher is the human who chooses the simulation, knowingly. He has been outside, he has tasted the real, and he decides the real is worse than the dream. He would rather eat a steak that doesn't exist than eat real food in a ruined world. He negotiates his return to ignorance. He sells his companions for a comfortable lie. The Gnostic texts do not have a direct category for Cypher, but they have a concept, the soul that has become so thoroughly enmeshed with matter that it can no longer tolerate the idea of its own liberation. The soul that has confused its chains with its identity. There is a passage in the Pistis Sophia, a later Gnostic text, more densely layered than the Nag Hammadi materials, that describes souls who return to the cycle not because they are forced to, but because they have forgotten completely that anything else was ever available. Cypher is not a traitor in the moral sense. Cypher is a soul who chose the forgetting. And that might be the most unsettling thing the film contains. Here's what the standard Matrix analysis completely misses. Everyone agrees the architect is the one in control. He built the system. He manages the cycles. He is, in the most surface-level reading, the demiurge, the constructor of the false world, the rational intelligence that assembled and maintains the simulation. And that reading is not wrong. But it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously once you've spent time in the Gnostic source material. Because the architect, as the demiurge, does not actually understand what he's dealing with. He understands his system. He is extraordinary at managing his system. He has run the cycle 6 times. He has accounted for every variable. He can predict Neo's responses to a statistically significant margin. But he cannot account for the thing he did not design and cannot control: the light, the fragment, the pneumatic awareness that keeps surfacing in the system no matter how many times the cycle resets. In the Apocryphon of John, Yaldabaoth creates the human being as an attempt to contain and harness the light that Sophia accidentally transferred into matter. The demiurge is not indifferent to the light. He is desperate to control it. He creates an elaborate world around it specifically to keep it from recognizing itself. Every archon, every layer of the heavens described in the Apocryphon, every password and seal, all of it exists as a containment mechanism around the one thing the demiurge cannot destroy and cannot fully own. The architect's problem is identical. He cannot delete Neo. He can only offer Neo a controlled choice. The anomaly, the pneumatic awareness that keeps surfacing in the simulation, cannot be processed through normal means. So the architect designs a mechanism to manage it. He creates a controlled valve, a release point, a negotiated exception. He calls it choice. He offers Neo the door on the right. But here's where the oracle enters the picture. And here is where the Gnostic reading becomes genuinely strange. The oracle is not a servant of the system. She operates inside the system. She speaks the system's language. She uses the system's framework of prophecy and chosen ones and destiny. But her actual function is to accelerate Neo's self-recognition. She tells him he is not the one. Specifically so that he will stop waiting to become something and start seeing what he already is. She is a catalyst for gnosis, not a dispenser of information. This is the Sophianic function. Sophia, in the Gnostic texts, is not simply a figure who made a mistake. Her mistake, her unauthorized emanation, the act of creation without the proper syzygy, without her divine counterpart, produced Yaldabaoth and the material world. But Sophia then immediately begins working to correct what she set in motion. She is present in matter. Her light is distributed through the pneumatic human beings she intervened to protect. And she keeps intervening, keeps descending, keeps working within the system she accidentally created to guide the fragments back toward recognition. The oracle is Sophia inside the machine. She cannot destroy the system from the outside. She is embedded in it. But she can nudge. She can place exactly the right information in front of exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. She gives Neo a cookie. She tells him not to worry about the vase. And every interaction she has, without exception, moves the pneumatic soul one step closer to the recognition the architect has spent 6 cycles trying to prevent. One viewer wrote in after my video on the demiurge, "This is the last video you'll ever need about the demiurge," and said something that stopped me mid-coffee. They wrote, "The part that got me was realizing the demiurge isn't evil in the way I thought. He's not malicious. He's just limited. He genuinely believes his world is the only world, and that's almost sadder." That comment lived in my head for 2 days, because it is exactly right, and it is exactly what the Matrix captures in the architect's scene. He is not cruel, he is contained. He is a god who cannot see past the edge of his own construction. The oracle sees past the edge. That is her defining characteristic and her defining limitation simultaneously. She can see beyond the system, but she must work from inside it. That tension is the most Sophianic thing in the entire trilogy, and it is precisely the kind of detail you would not notice on a casual viewing, or even on a careful viewing, if you hadn't spent time with the actual source material first. Because the Nag Hammadi texts do not give you a simple villain. They give you a flawed emanation who genuinely believes in what he built, and a wounded divine figure who keeps trying to fix what she broke. Those are not simple narrative categories. Those are the categories of a cosmology sophisticated enough to hold real contradiction. There's a line in the first Matrix film that I've come back to more times than I can count. Morpheus says it when he's showing Neo the real world for the first time. He gestures at the cracked sky, the ruined earth, the scorched atmosphere, and he says, "Welcome to the desert of the real." The phrase is borrowed. Morpheus is quoting Baudrillard, the French philosopher whose work on simulation and hyperreality the Wachowskis acknowledged as direct source material. But the concept underneath that phrase is older than Baudrillard by about 19 centuries, and the Gnostic version of it is more precise, more unsettling, and frankly more honest about the actual problem. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world is called the kenoma, the void, the lower realm. Not evil as a moral category. The texts are careful about this, more careful than most popular summaries suggest, but deficient, lacking. The kenoma is real in the sense that it has effects, that it has weight and consequence and physical causation. But it is not real in the deeper sense of participating in the pleroma, the divine fullness, the complete and undivided light from which everything ultimately originates. The desert of the real in the Matrix is the kenoma. It is the dimension that is actually real by contrast with the simulation, but it is not yet the pleroma. Zion is not paradise. Zion is survival. Zion is human beings living in a machine-bored cavern eating nutrient paste and dancing around fires because the alternative is being consumed by the system they barely escaped. The desert of the real is not the destination. It is the first layer of the wake-up. And this is where the Gnostic framework does something that most spiritual frameworks refuse to do. It acknowledges that awakening is not the same as arriving. The pneumatic soul who wakes up inside the kenoma, who recognizes the archonic construction for what it is, who sees through the simulation, that soul is now awake inside a broken world. Not liberated, awake, which is both better and harder than being asleep. I spent an evening a few months ago rereading the sections of the Pistis Sophia that deal specifically with this transit, the soul that has achieved recognition but has not yet completed the return to the pleroma. And what struck me, sitting with those passages, was how clearly the text refuses to offer false comfort. The soul that wakes up is not done. It is not home. It is clear-eyed inside a system designed to exhaust it, confuse it, pull it back toward the forgetting. The archons don't stop working on you the moment you see them. In some sense, the texts suggest, they work harder. Neo's situation after the first film is exactly this. He can stop bullets, he can see the code, he has had his moment of recognition. But the war is not over. If anything, the war intensifies around him. The system escalates. Agent Smith replicates. The architect reveals the cycle's true nature. And Neo spends the next two films discovering that gnosis, direct interior knowledge of what he is, does not dissolve the world he's in. It changes his relationship to it, which is not the same thing. This is the part of the Gnostic framework that is most frequently flattened in popular summaries. People hear, the material world is an illusion, and they extrapolate to, therefore the material world doesn't matter. The actual texts say something far more demanding. The material world is a deficient construction, but you are inside it. You have a body, you have relationships, you have consequences. Gnosis doesn't dissolve those. It gives you a different relationship to them. It means you are no longer unconsciously serving the system's purposes while believing you're freely choosing your own life. You are still in the kenoma. You are now conscious inside the kenoma. And consciousness inside the kenoma carries its own enormous weight. Morpheus asks Neo, early in the first film, whether he believes in fate. Neo says no, because he doesn't like the idea that he isn't in control of his own life. And Morpheus says, why not? It's one of those exchanges that reads as a simple character moment on first viewing. On the other side of the Nag Hammadi material, it lands differently. Because the Gnostic understanding of fate, of Heimermene, the astrological and archonic compulsion that governs the hylic and psychic souls, is precisely about this. The soul that doesn't know the archons are real is fully subject to their influence. It mistakes archonic compulsion for its own desire. It mistakes the simulation's parameters for the natural contours of the world. It does not recognize control because it has never seen the hand holding the strings. Neo's rejection of fate is, in this reading, his first pneumatic instinct. not a philosophical position, a reflex. The divine spark refusing, even before it fully awakens, to accept the constructed limits as absolute. And that reflex, that gut-level impossibility of settling for the simulation, is the thing the archons cannot manufacture and cannot finally extinguish, no matter how many versions of the cycle they run. And that's where I want to leave you. Not at the level of film theory, not at the level of symbol spotting or intellectual pattern matching, because anyone can do that. Anyone can watch The Matrix and say, "Oh yes, the red pill is gnosis," and feel like they've done something. That's not gnosis. That's just a library card. What the Nag Hammadi texts demand, what they have always demanded, is that the recognition doesn't stop at the conceptual level. It has to become interior. It has to pierce something. And that's the move the Wachowskis encoded into the film so precisely that I genuinely do not know how they did it without sitting with these texts themselves. Because here's what most people miss when they surface read The Matrix as a Gnostic allegory. They stop at the cosmology. They map the demiurge onto the machines. They map the archons onto Agent Smith. They celebrate the red pill as an awakening metaphor, and they walk away satisfied. I was one of those people. I watched the film a dozen times over 15 years, and I thought I understood what it was doing. Then I read the Nag Hammadi. Not summaries, not YouTube explainers, the texts themselves. The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip, the Hypostasis of the Archons, the Tripartite Tractate. I spent the better part of 3 weeks doing almost nothing else in the evenings, sitting with these documents, which are strange and dense and sometimes infuriating, and by the end of that third week, I watched The Matrix again, alone, late at night. And I had to pause it 4 times because something kept surfacing that I couldn't push back down. The film isn't illustrating Gnostic cosmology, it's enacting it. There's a difference. Illustration keeps you at a distance. Enactment pulls you through. Every structure in the film, not just the plot, but the experience of watching it, mirrors what the Gnostic texts describe as the process of awakening. The initial strangeness, the resistance, the terrible cost of not being able to go back. The discovery that the helpers, the real ones, cannot give you the knowledge directly. They can only create the conditions in which you remember it yourself. Morpheus never tells Neo what the Matrix is. He offers the red pill and says the rest is yours to see. That's not a cinematic convenience. That's the pneumatic structure of Gnosis itself. Direct, interior, unmediated. The Pistis Sophia describes a soul that has fallen into matter, been disoriented by the archons, and cannot find its way back until something within it, not something given to it from outside, begins to stir. The soul doesn't receive a map, it recovers a compass. That is precisely what Neo's arc is. Not instruction, recovery. Now here's what I personally think is the most overlooked element of the entire film, and I want to say it plainly. The moment that carries the entire Gnostic argument isn't the red pill scene. It's the scene with the Oracle. Because the Oracle does something that no Archon and no external authority can do. She tells Neo a truth she knows he's not ready to hear, and she tells it in a way that gives him the freedom to find it himself. She says, "You're not the one," and Neo believes her. And that belief becomes the very mechanism by which he eventually recognizes that he is. She didn't lie to him. She gave him exactly what he needed to kindle his own recognition rather than borrow hers. That is Gnosis operating as pedagogy. That is the Gnostic teacher's role described with more precision than most academic papers manage. So stop. And I mean that as a practical instruction, not a rhetorical one. Stop collecting information about awakening as though the collection itself is the awakening. The Gnostic tradition was not a reading list, it was a rupture. The question the Nag Hammadi leaves you with, the one that doesn't dissolve after you close the text, is not what is the Matrix, it's whether you are, right now, in it. Whether the framework you've been handed for understanding reality, for understanding yourself, for understanding what you are and what you're capable of, and what limits are actually real, whether any of it is yours, or whether it was constructed for you by forces that benefit from you never asking. Neo asked. That's the whole story. He asked, and the asking cost him everything comfortable, and on the other side of that cost was something that could not be taken back. You were not made to live inside a simulation someone else designed. You were made to recognize the hand behind it, and recognition, once it happens, cannot be undone. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. This is for anyone who senses there's more to this reality than we've been told, and who's ready to remember it. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that.